Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Armando, for that nice introduction, and thank you to Raven Pack as well for inviting me to speak. It's always a good challenge to be the first speaker of the day because your duty is not just to provide an interesting discussion, but to inject some energy to wake everybody up and have some enduring energy that'll last throughout the day. So I hope I'm up to both challenges. I've been talking about privacy and big data in countless forums around the world for not just the last 5 or 6 years since the controversy over the Snowden story emerged, but even before that. And I speak to a lot of different types of groups. I speak a lot at academic conferences at universities, to privacy advocacy groups, to hacker communities that are trying to develop privacy tools. And it's interesting that increasingly I've been receiving a lot more invitations to speak at conferences like this of professionals who actually work in finance and big data. And in a lot of ways, although it might be counterintuitive as somebody who works in the politics and philosophy of privacy, it really is true that these are the kinds of settings and venues that I enjoy speaking at most frequently, in part because the people who attend conferences like these wake up in the morning and your job isn't to sit around pondering the philosophy of privacy, it's to work to exploit data for commercial purposes, and therefore I think people tend to be a lot more open-minded and the discussion tends to be a lot more vibrant surrounding privacy and data, as opposed to people who have spent years focusing in on the debate and therefore have a lot more dogmatic opinions about it, but also because in a lot of ways it's a more consequential setting. You're the people who work with the data and who make determinations about how it's exploited and therefore the level of privacy that is accorded to it. And so it's always more interesting to me to speak in venues like this, increasingly where the people who ultimately are kind of the final decision makers, as it were, in terms of the level of privacy we enjoy, how data is exploited, are actually made. So privacy is a word that we hear so often, especially these days, that we just implicitly assume that we have a good understanding both of what it means and how we think about it. And I think that's actually really not quite true. Privacy is a really elusive concept to talk about and to discuss and to evaluate. And I know, as somebody who has spent years now devoting a lot of my work to talking about it, to this very day I have trouble defining it, talking about what it means, and most importantly, trying to articulate what its importance actually is. And it's really a challenging task to do that. And I think that one of the things that has happened is that has been, in many ways, by design. Every time I see phrases like this, like behind us, big data and privacy, or how to exploit big data and monetize big data, or what the role of privacy is, I think a lot about the experience I had as a kid with my grandparents, and I used to be befuddled and really bewildered and fascinated when I thought about my grandparents' lives and how they were born into an era where the technologies that came to dominate the society and shape their world simply didn't exist. And it used to fascinate me that one day these technologies, like the availability of telephones or the availability of air travel or television, simply were unthinkable for their childhood and into their early adulthood. And then all of a sudden, one day, these technologies were born and started to shape their world out of nowhere. And I used to wonder, what must that be like to be born into a world that suddenly is reshaped by a technology that simply didn't exist at the time that they were born and began to understand the world. And like so many depressing things, I now have that experience of being like my grandparents, because like anybody over the age of 25, I too was born into a world where one of the most predominant technologies in human innovations, if not the most predominant technology in human innovation, the internet, simply didn't exist. I didn't begin using the internet until I was in my mid-20s in law school in New York, and the internet back then was something radically, fundamentally different, really the opposite of what it is now. So it's even newer than that suggests. The internet, to me, when I began using it, was these companies that had these insulated, balkanized, segmented services like AOL or CompuServe that were really like the digital Wild West. You would get a CD, you would put the CD into your computer, download the program, and then in the most untraceable way, you could adopt any identity, engage in any behavior, become anyone or anything that you wanted without any concept that it could ever be linked to who you actually were. There was total anonymity, total privacy to everything it is that one did on what was then considered to be the internet. And that attribute was central to how we understood what this innovation was, why we believed it was so important, and what ultimately we thought the promise of it would be. Around this early framework of the internet sprung these kind of internet utopian philosophers who thought that this innovation was going to be the greatest tool of human liberalization and emancipation ever known. It would allow human beings to communicate with one another in total anonymity without any detection by powerful corporate or governmental factions. It was an image of almost egalitarian nirvana. And in a remarkably short period of time, just a matter of 2 decades, this innovation has radically transformed into something completely different. In fact, virtually its full-scale opposite, namely not the greatest tool of human emancipation or egalitarianism ever created, but potentially the greatest tool of human monitoring, surveillance, and therefore control ever innovated. Because in contrast to those early Wild West days where we could do anything without detection online, it's now almost impossible, even if you have the greatest technological sophistication, to do anything without detection. So it hasn't just changed radically, but in fundamental ways. And that, of course, has necessarily prompted the question of what role does privacy play in the digital age, if any? And for a long time, there was an attempt, whether by design or incidental, I think it was by design, but it really makes no difference since it was really the outcome, on the part of Silicon Valley and the tech giants to persuade people to think that privacy really played no role in the digital age. And that was because privacy, according to this theory, really has no real value for those of us who are good citizens, for people who aren't doing things like plotting terrorist attacks or using the internet to engage in pedophilia or other serious criminality. The theory was promulgated that as long as you're not one of those bad people, you actually have nothing to hide and therefore have no reason to value your privacy. And this was something that was stated explicitly by the most influential people in Silicon Valley at the end of the aughts. There was a particularly notorious interview given by the CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, who, when asked about all the different ways that his company was enabling data about us to be collected and therefore information about our private lives to be harvested and collected without our consent, responded by saying, well, if there are things that you're doing that you don't want anyone to know about, that's probably a pretty good indication that you ought not to be doing that in the first place. And then the next year in 2009, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO and founder of Facebook, pronounced, presumably on behalf of his generation, that privacy, he said, is no longer a social norm or a societal norm. So you have this political value that has been debated for centuries. It goes back to at least the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. As an American in London, I like to talk about the American Revolution whenever I can. And one of the central values that gave rise to the rebellion against the British Crown on behalf of the American colonialists was this idea of general warrants, the idea that the king could at any time invade houses of communities where criminals were on the loose or in the name of finding a bad person. And the founders created a constitution, one of the principal purposes of which was to preserve this value that Silicon Valley has spent a lot of years now telling us that we ought to disregard and devalue by saying that, no, actually the government can't just enter our homes without any cause. It has to first demonstrate to a court that there's good probable cause to believe that we've actually done something that justifies this invasion of our privacy, that our home, that our papers, that our information, that our data about ourselves is actually sacred, and that it's radically important that we safeguard it, even if it means that we make it harder, for example, for the police to apprehend killers or rapists who might be on the loose in our community. This value was so important, we decided in the 18th century and the 19th century that we would rather risk having these criminals escape than having this value eroded. And so there was an attempt on the part of Silicon Valley, for obvious commercial reasons, but also for philosophical reasons, to start to claim that this value was sort of archaic, that it was something that only prior generations, but not the new generation, valued. And this ethos arose because these companies depended upon people voluntarily offering up as much of their data about themselves as they possibly could, that there was no reason for them to worry about doing so unless, as I said earlier, they were bad people planning to do bad things. And if you think about it, that precept, there's no reason to care about privacy unless you're a bad person doing bad things, has a pretty insidious converse to it, which is that if you are somebody who cares about privacy, if you are somebody who is interested in safeguarding information about yourself and about your life, then that must mean, by definition, that you are a bad person trying to do bad things. And one of the things that I've discovered is that this argument has a very strong intuitive appeal. It is not easy to articulate a case about why we ought to care about privacy, because privacy is at best, second-order necessity for life. There are things that you can easily understand why people go out into the street and protest and march over when they're deprived of it, things like food for their children or access to health care that are first-order needs for survival, whereas privacy is much more abstract, it's much more ephemeral, and therefore much more difficult to defend or to get people to care about. And so it's very common nowadays to hear people say, you know what, I actually don't care very much about my privacy. I don't care if the government trolls through my emails or if big corporations are tracking what it is that I'm doing, because I'm not doing anything wrong, and therefore I have nothing to hide. It's something that I hear to this very day in every venue wherever I discuss the question of privacy. I can pretty much guarantee that there are some people in this room who subscribe to that view, and I can guarantee even further that there are all of you who know people who do. And so it's been a challenge for those of us who have tried to present a countervailing way of looking at this to get people to think about privacy in a different way, precisely because it is an abstraction, precisely because it's not as easy or tangible to understand why we need it as the food that we consume or the health care that we seek for our children. And one of the things that I began to realize after spending a number of years engaged in this debate and hearing this line of argument, well, I don't actually really care about my privacy, privacy isn't really something that we care about, is I began to realize that there's actually nobody who genuinely believes it, including the people who most vehemently proclaim that they do. So using the two examples that I gave earlier, Eric Schmidt and Mark Zuckerberg, in the year after Eric Schmidt gave that interview in 2009, where he said, well, if there's things that you're doing that you don't want others to know about, that's probably a good indication that you shouldn't be doing them in the first place, the online privacy and technology magazine CNET decided to do an experiment. They decided that they were going to compile a dossier about Eric Schmidt's personal life using exclusively services provided by Google. They were just going to investigate Eric Schmidt using Google products. And the profile that they were able to compile about him, where he lives, where he went, where his private jet landed, where his finances were located, what kind of photographs he was putting online, was so invasive and so comprehensive that Eric Schmidt was so indignant about the profile and how much it invaded his personal life that he ordered Google employees never to speak to CNET again, an order that endured for, I think, 2 years. And the very same Mark Zuckerberg who proclaimed that privacy is no longer a social norm in 2010 purchased a home in California, and about 6 months later spent $30 million to purchase the 4 homes surrounding it so that he could create a buffer of privacy to prevent media and others from seeing what it was that he was doing inside of his estate. Every single person takes steps in some way, including those who claim they don't value privacy, to safeguard the privacy they claim not to care about. People put and use locks on their bedroom and bathroom doors. They put password protections on their email and their social media accounts. People, all of us, have something to hide, whether we're terrorists or not, whether we're pedophiles or not, whether we're criminals or not. There are all sorts of things that we're willing to share with our physician or our psychiatrist or our spouse or our best friend that we would be mortified if other people in the world, including colleagues or the general public, were to know. That is a form of proclaiming that privacy is a critical function in our lives. And, every time that I've gone anywhere in the world and I've heard somebody say to me, oh, privacy isn't really something that I care that much about. I'm not doing anything wrong. I don't really care if the government trolls through my personal information or if corporations track what I'm doing because I'm not a bad person and therefore I have nothing to hide. I always do the same experiment with them. I take out a pen and a piece of paper and I write down my email address on it and I give it to them and I say, here's what I'd like you to do. When you get home, what I want you to do is take this email address that I just gave you of mine and I want you to email to me all of the passwords to all of your email and social media accounts. Not just like the good, respectable ones that you use in your name for work, but all of them. So that, I can just kind of troll through it, see what it is that you're doing and saying, and then maybe publish under your name information that I've gleaned about what it is that you're doing. And to this very day, not a single person has taken me up on that offer. That email box is a very lonely and solitary place. And the reason for that is because we have an intuitive understanding, even if we can't articulate exactly why, that privacy is not some distant luxury, but is actually fundamental to our ability to live as free and fulfilled human beings, that although it may not be as immediate as water and food and healthcare in terms of our ability to survive, it's certainly far more important than some abstract luxury that we can relinquish without missing or without losing part of what makes life valuable. And there's a lot of, I think, social science that is very illustrative of why that is. There's enormous amounts of social science, in fact, that tells us something that I don't actually think we need social science to tell us, that I think we know intuitively, which is that when we are being monitored, when we are being watched, our behavior changes radically. The decisions that we make when we think somebody is watching what we're doing and assessing and evaluating and judging what we're doing diminishes greatly. The range of choices that we have available to us as human beings shrinks very quickly the moment we believe other people are casting judgmental eyes upon us. There are social experiments as simple as putting two people in separate rooms, and one of the rooms has a picture of an eye on it to suggest that subliminally someone is being watched, just a picture of an eye. And the other room doesn't have that. And then researchers will ask people in each of the rooms what they believe about a variety of controversial political opinions. And the people who are in the room with the eye watching over them will give far more conventional answers, the sort of answers that they believe societal orthodoxy expects of them. Whereas the people who are without the eye are much freer in terms of opining on issues of the day, much more willing to give controversial or unpopular answers. And that's because we, I think, know that when we're being monitored, our behavior becomes much more conformist and much more compliant and much more submissive. And there's some really fascinating innovations from the Industrial Revolution that are based, if not explicitly, at least implicitly, on this recognition. One of the most interesting of which is the work that was done by the 17th century philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who, in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, wanted to answer a question that societies began asking themselves, which is, as we transformed from a society that lived in small little villages where people were known to one another and instead began congregating in large cities, and as institutions transformed from very small, easily manageable ones into massive ones of thousands and thousands of people, how could institutions continue to monitor and control the behavior of the people within them given the size that now they had to manage? And he began actually wondering about prisons, because prisons went from small little village prisons where it was easy to watch all the prisoners because there were 30 or 40 or 50 of them, into massive cosmopolitan prisons with thousands of prisoners. And how do you maintain order and make sure that prisoners are behaving the way that you want them to behave? And his response to that as a philosopher was architectural in nature. It was to design what he called a panopticon, which was a tower. It's very architecturally simple but philosophically complex. It was a tower that was designed to be so high that guards could see everything that prisoners were doing, but no prisoner could ever see into the guard tower. And the genius of it was that the prisoners, because they couldn't actually see when they were ever being monitored, had to always assume that they were being monitored at all times. You couldn't tell when a prisoner was when a guard was watching you or when a guard wasn't watching you, and therefore you had to assume a guard was always watching you. And the epiphany that Bentham had was that this realization, to put into people's minds that they have the possibility of being monitored at any time without necessarily knowing whether or not they were being monitored, would foster more compliant behavior, even then attempting to watch them at all times. And Michel Foucault in the 20th century said that this epiphany that Bentham had began to be applied beyond prisons to mental institutions, to large factories, to educational institutions, and ultimately became the linchpin of how modern technological contemporary society controls large populations, with the instilling them with the knowledge that they're always being watched. And whenever the privacy debate is discussed, it's almost inevitable that you have to talk about the novel 1984 by the British author George Orwell, which I used to hate doing because it's so banal. It's something school children read. It seems very trite to talk about. And even more so, whenever I would talk about 1984 in the context of these privacy debates, I would always be met with this immediate objection, which is that 1984 is not really applicable to our current predicament, because in 1984, the dystopic society that Orwell imagined was radically different than the one that we actually live in today. Because in 1984, as undoubtedly you all remember, every home had within it a monitoring screen where the government could monitor everything that people were doing inside their homes. And people would always say, I don't have that. I can turn my computer off. I can disconnect from the internet. I can go somewhere where I'm not actually being tracked. And so, yes, the dystopic warnings that Orwell issued are frightening and they're alarming. And if we ever lived in a society like that, that would be something terrible. But that's not the society in which we actually live. But people who say that are actually misremembering what 1984 described, the society that Orwell, through his narrator, Winston Smith, created. There are multiple passages in 1984 that are actually fundamental to the text that I think illuminate this debate in the most powerful way possible. There are multiple times where Winston Smith emphasizes about these monitors that are placed in people's homes that you could never actually know when it was that you were being monitored. The TV, the monitor never actually indicated to you when it was that you were being observed. In fact, said Winston Smith, there was a lot of doubt about whether these monitors ever were used at all, about whether they even worked at all. What made them so menacing, he said, was that they offered the potential to monitor you. And knowing that there was the potential that you could be monitored at any time put in your head the necessity to assume, just like the prisoners in Bentham's Panopticon, that you were always being monitored, and therefore you would voluntarily behave as though you were always being monitored, even though you might not always be monitored. In fact, even though you might never be monitored at all. And it's that framework, the possibility of surveillance and of being watched, that makes behavior change so radically, that fosters conformity, that fosters a more compliant and dissent-free society. And that, I think, is how we understand privacy intuitively, why we understand on a visceral level why it matters so much, even if we're not able to articulate it, because we all have the personal experience from the time that we're conscious of 5, 6, 7 years old of the differences in our behavior between what we're willing to do when we're not being watched versus how we feel constrained when we are being watched. That difference, as I said, doesn't require a lot of social science to confirm, even though it does. It's something ingrained within us, and I think is a reason why we continue so vigorously to defend a value that, even for those of us who work with it for years, often have difficulty articulating. Another way of, I think, thinking about this is that it really is a society that has a zone where you can go where you're not being monitored, where there's no capability to observe you, where you can make decisions without judgmental eyes being cast upon you, where things like creativity and individuality and dissent and innovation exclusively reside. And so a society in which we say, well, privacy is something that is no longer a social norm. We're willing to give up privacy because of all the benefits we get, because now we have programs that tell us the easiest way to get from one point to the other while avoiding traffic, or that enable translation devices to be able to understand how the human brain works. A society in which we give up that value, one that has been cherished for hundreds of years, over which wars have been waged, is one in which we lose not only a huge amount of what makes our life free, but also one that makes our society free. And so I think thinking about those implications is critical to thinking about what it means when we think about how to exploit big data, how to monetize big data, and how to use it. Now, one of the things I think is so interesting is that you see this change in so many ways, not just on college campuses where people have the luxury to theorize about privacy, or people like me, journalists or writers who have the luxury of sitting around thinking about it in these abstract ways, but it really is now becoming a commercial imperative, which is why I suggested that this title be Why Privacy Matters ethically and commercially. For the first couple of years after the Snowden revelations and the controversies that ensued, I typically did speak about privacy more in the kind of philosophical and political terms in which I just spoke of it, or psychological terms. But increasingly, it's really become more of a commercial debate than a philosophical or a political one. And that's the reason why these days the invitations I get to speak about privacy come less from privacy advocacy groups and college campuses, which already have debated these issues, and more from associations like the one that you're gathered to have now, because there's almost no way to think about privacy without thinking about its commercial implications, because companies that ignore privacy as a value and that pretend or believe that people don't care about it will suffer in great ways financially and commercially. And in some sort of karmic justice, it's the Silicon Valley giants who first led the way in trying to persuade people to disregard privacy, who are now paying the biggest price for being perceived as its greatest violators. It's really fascinating. Some of the first documents that I ever looked at when I first began working with Edward Snowden and those documents, among the most shocking things to me was the magnitude of the surveillance that was taking place in what we call democracies, and yet it was almost entirely unbeknownst to the entire population. It included the United States, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, the alliance called the Five Eye Alliance. And I remember seeing a document once, the first time I saw it, there's a motto that the Five Eyes Alliance has, which are the group of 5 espionage agencies. They have a motto, just like your companies do, just like Hertz Rent-A-Car, any company, they too have a motto. And their motto was, collect it all. Not collect all the terrorist communications or collect all the data about criminals. It was collect it all. They literally wanted to convert the internet age into one in which privacy no longer existed by developing the capacity to collect and store and then analyze and evaluate all forms of electronic communication and human transactions that occurred digitally. And among the leaders in enabling that motto to be not something that was some distant aspiration, but increasingly a reality, were the leading tech companies, Facebook, Google, Apple, and the rest. And there was a program called PRISM that was a collaborative program between these agencies on the one hand and Silicon Valley on the other. And they were able to do this in secret because there was no price to pay, because nobody knew that they were doing it. And then in the wake of the Snowden revelations, which created a huge controversy politically, journalistically, diplomatically, I often get asked to this very day, you know, there was this huge story that you were able to create, this huge controversy globally that ensued, but what really has changed? Because these governments are still collecting large amounts of data, as are these companies, and that's true. But there are massive changes that have taken place. There are some legislative and international conventions, legislative reforms and international conventions designed to protect privacy. There are changes in individual user habits that people use encryption and other means of protecting their privacy. They're much more likely to use communication devices that promise to protect privacy than the ones that they believe will turn their data over to the government, again illustrating that they care a great deal about their privacy by their behavior, even if not by their words. But the biggest change has been the relationship between tech giants on the one hand and government agencies on the other, which prior to 2013 was extremely collaborative. Anytime governments asked for data from Silicon Valley, they got it without having to present much reasons for why they wanted it, without having to offer much justification. But ever since that collaboration became known, thanks to the reporting enabled by Edward Snowden, all over the world, people began to wake up and say, I don't actually want to use companies that I believe are going to jeopardize my privacy. I want to use companies that promise me that they're going to safeguard my privacy. And people at Facebook and people at Google and people at Twitter and people throughout Silicon Valley began to have nightmares that the current generation and the next generation and the generation after that were going to abandon using their services in lieu of using the services of, for example, companies in Germany or South Korea or Brazil that pitched themselves and marketed themselves by saying, don't use Facebook, don't use Google, because they're going to turn your data over to the NSA or the GCHQ. Instead, use our services because we will protect your data. And companies that began to develop technologies designed to offer the promise of protecting end-to-end encryption, such as WhatsApp or Signal or Telegram, began to proliferate because commercially people began to realize that there's a major benefit, even if you don't care about the philosophical, psychological, and political components of privacy, there's a major commercial value to being a company perceived as protecting the data of your customers, even as you try and exploit and monetize it. And most of the controversies here in Europe, in the United States, in Latin America, in Asia, are all now emerging out of this realization that there is a very potent commercial imperative to protecting privacy. There are genuine threats posed to the dominance of Facebook and Google because of the perception that they have been reckless or worse with people's personal data. There are threats to break them up, to treat them and regulate them as public utilities, to regulate them far more aggressively than they've ever been regulated before. There's a huge amount of open space now, people believe, to start to create competitors that are able credibly to offer a promise of protecting people's data that 5 or 10 years ago simply didn't exist. And so it's been really fascinating to me as somebody whose interest in privacy is principally political and philosophical and psychological, to watch the debate now transform into one that has become far more commercial and financial in nature, something that I didn't expect, but which I'm overjoyed about. Because the companies that deal in big data now have not just corporate ethical responsibilities as good corporate citizens to protect data, but very strong financial incentives to do so, and that has really transformed the debate more than, I think, almost anything else. And so that is the reason, as I began by saying, I'm always most excited to be able to speak to groups like this one, people who work with data, who think primarily about how to exploit and use and monetize it, but not as much about how to protect privacy, because that's not necessarily your jobs. Because increasingly, it's becoming easier to persuade people to care because it's in everyone's economic self-interest to do so. The political scandals, the economic scandals, the technology scandals of the last 5 years surrounding things like Cambridge Analytica, surrounding things like Google and Facebook, and the way in which they've been abusing privacy, all in some sense vindicate what aren't just decades, but centuries of thinking and philosophizing and debating and organizing and even engaging in revolutions in defense of this value that for a long time people have had a hard time understanding why it's so important, and yet now are seeing through people's behavior, through the behavior of their own users and their own customers, that although we do need to have other people know what it is we're doing, we like to put information about ourselves online because we're political animals. We need to have others hear from us and know about us. That's why, for example, if you put someone in prolonged solitary confinement, you can drive them insane, because we have a human need for human beings to know things about us. We have a countervailing human need to have places we can go in the world where we can make decisions and experiment, and explore without feeling as though we're being watched and monitored at all times. And that human desire, that human need, that human instinct is every bit as compelling a part of human nature as the countervailing need to engage in interaction with other human beings. And I think that that has really reshaped privacy philosophically, politically, and increasingly commercially. So with those thoughts, I will leave you with that. We have about 10 minutes, which is what I was hoping we would have to engage in a discussion with questions and answers. So thanks again to Raven Pack, and thank you all for listening.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you very much for that presentation. So this is a quantitative finance group, so we know some of the research behind this. Last year we had Mark Salmon speak on the notion of false positives and false negatives. Here's a good research paper that just came out by Madeline Udall and Alex Townsend. Why are big data matrices approximately low rank? Without getting into the technicals, what he's basically saying is we always do dimensional reduction, and so we're always going to have both false positives and false negatives in any model that we design. In the context of what you're talking about, that's great if you've got Netflix, because that increases your engagement rate. That's terrible if you're law enforcement or a intelligence service, because what it's saying is that the threshold of beyond a reasonable doubt will never be met. Can you comment a little bit on how some of this might be used in the court cases that are coming out with respect to the thresholds of reasonable doubt?
Yeah, it's a great question, particularly because the primary justification, particularly in the last, say, 20 years in the wake of the attacks of September 11th and some of the horrific terrorist attacks that have taken place throughout the West, many of which have taken place in this city where we're gathered, have made security the primary justification, one of the primary justifications for why invasions of privacy and the creation of a system of mass surveillance are so necessary. And that has a very strong emotional punch that it packs for the reason that I said earlier, which is that while privacy is a second-order need, survival or physical safety is a first-order need. And so if you present successfully, the choice is being let the government track you while you're online, or have stadiums be blown up where your kids are enjoying a concert, people are going to be willing to sacrifice their privacy in the name of security. That's just a natural human instinct. And I think one of the critical parts to note about that is it's based on a false premise, which is that the more we surveil, the more we monitor, the greater our security increases. You can debate whether or not you're willing to give up security, privacy in the name of security. As I said earlier, most Western countries have made the opposite decision. We don't just let the police barge into our homes, even though it would be way easier for them to find violent criminals if they were allowed to do so, or just search through our bank accounts, even though it would be way easier for them to catch violent criminals, because we want privacy. And so we're willing to give up some security to preserve privacy. But even for those who aren't, one of the things that I think is so important to note is that when you have a system in place that collects billions of pieces of data every single day, which is what Western security agencies do, not millions, but billions, it becomes harder, not easier, to find the people who are planning to blow up a bomb on the London subway system, or to detonate a bomb on a plane over Detroit on Christmas Day. One of the fascinating lessons after 9/11 was obviously the US asked the question, we spend $70 billion a year on intelligence. How is it that this relatively primitive plot involving dozens of people went undetected? And the answer wasn't, oh, well, it was because we weren't collecting enough data. The answer was we had collected so much data that we were incapable of understanding what it is that we had, of connecting the dots, so to say. We had enough information in our possession to enable us to have detected that plot. We just weren't able to recognize it because we were drowning in data. And that has been the case over and over and over. After the Boston Marathon, it turned out that the US government had plenty of warnings about the two brothers who blew up a bomb at the Boston Marathon and yet had so much data that they were incapable of recognizing it. Most of the people who perpetrate attacks end up inside this intelligence system, but again, because they're not focused enough specifically on the people where there's reason to believe they're engaged in wrongdoing, but instead are subjecting populations to mass surveillance, it actually makes it more difficult, not less, to find what it is that they say they're looking for. And I think that's one of the things that's important to realize is often the pretext for privacy invasions is not necessarily the actual reason. One of the things that surprised me the most going through the Snowden documents was how little of it had to do with the primary justification offered publicly, which was finding terrorists, and instead had to do with things like spying on trade negotiations, spying on human rights organizations for diplomatic and commercial advantages, and the like. So I think that there's often this assumption that the more data collected, the more advantage it confers, whether in terms of security or commercially. And there's a lot of experts and now a lot of examples empirically that prove that the opposite is true.
Glenn, we have a question trending on Slido. Susan can read it out for us.
Yeah. What do you do to protect your online privacy? Do you use services like Google, Facebook, etc.?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the difficulties in answering it is that the more you talk about your own security, the less effective it becomes. But certainly given the work that I do, and I think this is true of the work that anyone does that requires confidentiality. So I used to be a lawyer and I had a duty of confidentiality to my clients, and so I talk to lawyers all the time about this. I talk to journalists about this, whose duty is to protect the confidentiality of their sources. Obviously, physicians and psychiatrists have that duty to their patients, human rights activists have that duty, and people who work in the financial sector have that duty to the people whose money they manage, a duty of confidentiality. It is an ethical duty to research the best tools to use in order to speak in the most confidential manner, in a way that minimizes the chances that you will be detected. And so there are services, communication services, like I mentioned earlier, Signal and Telegram and WhatsApp, that do use various forms of encryption and therefore offer various forms of protection. There's email programs like PGP that are now easy enough for even technologically unsophisticated people such as myself to use with relative ease. That used to be the problem 5 years ago, is you had to be one of those almost kind of obsessive, nerdy hackers to be able to figure out how any of this works, and it's now become much more user-friendly. So it just takes a small amount of research to figure out which companies are reckless with privacy. Certainly I wouldn't use Facebook or Google for discussing information I regarded as even minimally sensitive, but I would use things like Signal and Telegram to do so. I think one of the things that's really important to realize is, as is true in life generally, there's no such thing as eliminating risk entirely. People who have used the most sophisticated programs like Tor in order to browse, or Tails in order to use as an operating system, have ended up being detected because they made mistakes or because their computer got overtaken. So there's never a way to eliminate risk, but you can certainly reduce risk, and anybody who works in any field where you have a duty of confidentiality, but even as a human being who has an interest in protecting your own privacy, there are things you can, and I submit should do, that aren't that hard, to just simply research what kinds of communication devices are now available that increase your level of privacy and anonymity as you use the internet and as you use other devices to communicate.
Great. We have time for maybe just one more question. We'll take one from Slido.
To what extent is privacy a Western value? The Chinese social credit system suggests that some societies consider privacy more of a third or fourth necessity.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I noticed during the Snowden reporting, where we did reporting in, I think, 28 different countries, is even within the West, there are radically different ways for understanding privacy. I mean, I would say the UK, for example, among the Western countries where we did the reporting, is probably on the furthest end of valuing privacy least. I mean, there's been debates about CCTVs and other kinds of monitoring, whereas Germany is probably on the exact other pole, in part because of its history with East Germany and with the Stasi. And so even within the West, you see a pretty wide range of cultural differences about how people value privacy. And then you go out of the West and it gets even more diverse still. But I would return nonetheless to the fact that I believe that privacy is not a cultural artifact. It's not something that is intrinsic to a particular way of thinking. It's really part of our human nature. And there's, again, all kinds of evolutionary studies, all kinds of psychological studies that demonstrate that intrinsic to human nature, not to any particular culture, but to human nature, is a compulsion to seek out places and seek out situations where we can explore and experiment and behave in ways that nobody is watching. It's just central to how our brain is functioning. Obviously, some cultures are more communal, others are more individual. So I don't mean to suggest there are no cultural differences, but privacy is not an artifact of the West or of particular societies. It's something that is endemic to how we as human beings are created, and I think is something that we just instinctively crave as a prerequisite to living a free and fulfilling life. So I think we're out of time. Thank you all once again for those excellent questions and for inviting me here. Really appreciate it.
This is Raven Pack.